Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here. So those of you who have been following my live streams recently will know that I've been throwing around the idea of reviewing books, kinda like I do for movies. It's something that I've wanted to do for quite a while, since I've been asked several times what my favourite books are and stuff like that, and it was suggested to me by a subscriber quite a while ago that I should try and branch out into reviewing other types of media. Another reason I wanted to start reviewing books now is because I've actually been doing a lot of reading lately. As my regular subscribers will know, due to my new job, I've been travelling all over the place. I do a lot of commuting around the city, and I often have to travel in and out of the city. So I spend quite a lot of time on trains and buses, and I work all over the country. So I find that the best way to pass the time during those journeys is to read a book. So lately I've been making a list of books that I've wanted to read for some time, as well as books that I read a long time ago in my childhood and that I wanted to reread and stuff like that. And I've been going through them one at a time, and this month alone I've actually read about 4 books. So yeah, a lot of reading lately. So expect to see some book reviews on the channel from time to time. It won't happen very often, but it will happen occasionally, and of course, let any feedback that you guys can give, I'd very much appreciate it. As you can tell by the title, the first book I'd like to review is The Godfather from 1969, written by Mario Puzzo. On a side note, I don't really know much about Mario Puzzo. I've never read anything else that guy has ever written, but I know that he became most famous for The Godfather. This is definitely his most revered and most well-known novel. I believe he wrote 4 books in the same series, but I've only ever read the first one, so again, anybody who's read the other 3, let me know in the comment section whether or not you want me to read them and talk about them. I'm open to the idea. As far as The Godfather goes, it's a book that I just read for the first time ever, after buying it from a charity shop. I actually never intended to get this book initially, I just happened to see it really cheap in one of those shops, and figured I'd give it a read. Right off the bat, I'll say that this is a book I enjoyed for the most part, and it took me about a week to read it, maybe not even that, which is quick for me since, despite being an avid reader, I am actually quite a slow reader for some reason. I'm not really sure why this is. It usually takes me a while to get through a full book, especially one that's relatively long like The Godfather, so I definitely found the story entertaining, but at the same time I did have a few issues with it, and there were a couple of things about it that I actually couldn't stand. Of course I'll talk about that later once I get to some of my criticisms, all in good time. So I'm sure if you clicked on the video, then I probably don't need to tell you about The Godfather and what it's based on, because even if you haven't read the book, chances are you've probably seen the movie that was based on it, or at very least you're clued up enough on pop culture to know all the popular one-liners and classic quotes, as well as the names of the main characters and all that good stuff. But just in case there's anyone who isn't familiar with all that, the book is about a fictional crime family named the Corleones, which are essentially a clan of Italian-American mobsters, inspired by the real-life mafia, more specifically the New York families, which are mentioned quite a few times in the book. And though the book has several protagonists throughout, with the story being told in a non-linear fashion, doing major time skips, jumping all over the place at times, with each chapter following a specific character, I think it's safe to say that the most prominent character of the story is Don Vito Corleone, since for the vast majority of the story he's the titular Godfather character we're presented with. Since I briefly mentioned the movie, which ironically, while being based on the book, is actually way more popular and influential than the book is, as well as more critically acclaimed than the book, at least more so than it was on its release, doing its bit to popularise the book, as well as mob stories in general. I saw the movie a few years back for the first time, and while I enjoyed it for the most part, I kind of felt that there was something missing from it, and I think after reading the book and doing a little bit of research into the Italian mafia, and learning a bit about that overall subculture, I think I figured out why that was. You see, I think in order to fully enjoy and appreciate a movie like The Godfather, and get the full experience of it, you have to at very least have some knowledge or understanding of how the mafia works, their overall hierarchy, structure, ranking system, their understanding of morality, how they generally go about their business, of course the overall terminology like what is a capo and all that good stuff, things like that. I feel like if you don't have at least some knowledge of that stuff before watching, then yeah, you can still watch and enjoy the movie, but there's going to be things about it that go over your head, and are just inconceivable to you. And that was definitely the case for me, because when I saw The Godfather, I knew absolutely nothing about the Italian mafia. On a side note, that's one of the things that has never really been an interest of mine. I've never really been able to understand the reason so many people have this seeming obsession with the Italian mafia to the point where they know pretty much everything about it and make it a big part of their overall identity. To each their own, it's just something that I've never personally been into. But of course, for the purpose of reviewing this book, I certainly did look into it a bit, and it helps me to enjoy the story a little bit more than I would otherwise. One thing that did occur to me while doing some research is that the story of The Godfather, in addition to being widely successful and influential in regards to other books, as well as movies and other pieces of media like that, it also seems to be largely responsible for the overall mafia obsession I was referring to. And I'm not the only one who's noticed this. There have actually been several books and articles written over the years criticising The Godfather for its romanticisation of organised crime, and how, while being a great story for the purpose of entertainment, was actually quite harmful in a lot of ways. See, the problem with The Godfather, and again this doesn't come from me, a lot of people have pointed this out over the years, is that as good a story as it was almost too good. What I mean by that is, if you're telling a story, even a story about the mob and organised crime, in order to get people invested in the story, you need to create characters who are somewhat morally relatable and understandable in some way. For example, if you were to write a bunch of characters who are all objectively evil, irredeemable, sociopathic nutcases with no redeemable qualities at all, the reader or viewer wouldn't have any reason to get invested in the story. The whole thing would just be way too morbid for the average person. So what you have with The Godfather, and this is necessary for a good story, is you have characters who, while being evil in some regards, are greatly humanised in a lot of ways. For example, characters like Michael, who is an absolute murderous psychopath, and you could argue he's a flat-out villain. He's given an origin story that gives a lot of context to why he turned out the way he did, and he's quite cleverly presented as a morally good person and a war hero at the beginning of the story, as well as a man who never wanted to live a criminal lifestyle. He was just forced into it due to unfortunate circumstances that were out of his control. That's how it's initially presented to the reader, but I noticed if you read the book carefully, and you can kind of see this in the movie as well, but not to the same extent of course, Michael's descent into madness and evil was heavily foreshadowed the entire way through. But again, he's given enough positive personality traits, as well as personal tragedies he has to go through, that makes him a morally relatable and human character, and the same can be said for quite a few of the characters. Of course, I will point out you do have some evil, degenerate monsters like Luca Brasi, for example, who plays a much more predominant role in the book than the movie, but the point still stands. In order for a story to be successful, it's got to have well-written and relatable characters to an extent. The problem with this is that it created a very idealistic, and if truth be told, unrealistic depiction of the mafia and organised crime in general, basically, like I said, romanticising the whole thing, making the likes of Al Capone look not like murderous savages, but general businessmen or politicians just trying to do the best they can with what they have, and providing services for the community and all that good stuff. Completely ignoring all the absolute degeneracy that was caused by organised crime, such as people being forced into debt slavery, having their lives completely ruined by the mob having a monopoly on business and trade, intimidating the competition, the extortion rackets that preyed on so many business owners, bleeding them dry and taking a percentage of their earnings by force, providing nothing in return, essentially pretending to offer protection. There was of course constant fighting within the mob, with innocents being caught in the crossfire, so many killings and betrayals, and just general terror that was caused by their pushing criminal activities. The mob was not something to be admired, and that's just a fact, but The Godfather influenced millions of people around the world, that it was something benevolent to an extent, or at very least morally ambiguous. And you have to wonder how many young Italian kids read the book, or saw the movie, and thought, I want to be like Don Corleone, and went on to become some low-level crook, in and out of prison, performing petty crimes and all that good stuff for an absolute pittance. It really does make you wonder. So yeah, that's something to bear in mind in regards to The Godfather. In its overall appeal and cultural significance, many people consider it the best mob story ever told to this day. But you could argue that it's had a very negative impact on society in general by romanticising organised crime and the mob. As far as the book itself, as I mentioned before, there's a lot I like about it, and a few specific things I don't. Let's talk about it. There's going to be a lot of spoilers in this video, so be prepared for that. It's a very old book. So as I mentioned earlier, the story is told in a non-linear fashion, and does a major time skip every chapter, with each one following a different protagonist. The early part of the book does its bit to do some world building, and it cleverly does this by having it cover the events of the wedding of the Don's daughter. The daughter herself isn't a particularly significant character, but her husband plays kind of a predominant role in the story, since he's kind of presented as one of the book's antagonists. More on that later. The wedding was a clever way to introduce the story, since it serves as an excuse to bring a whole bunch of the main characters together. Pretty early on you learn about Don Vito, his three sons, Sonny, Fredo and Michael. That Sonny is the oldest and kind of the alpha of the group and is touted as the successor to the throne. Whereas Michael, the Don's youngest son, is kind of the outcast of the family and is presented as being completely uninterested in the family business, choosing to instead join the army and go straight. You also get introduced to the Corleones' overall family and business structure, and how the writer does this is by having Michael dump a bunch of expedition into his girlfriend, who he brought as a date to the wedding. So while he's introducing her to his overall world, he gives a brief description of the many families, capos and enforcers, as well as the local businessmen and prominent figures in the community, all of which seem to show face and basically kiss the Don's ass. It's also explained that because it's his daughter's wedding, and the Don is an old-fashioned Sicilian, they have a particular tradition, and I'm not sure if this is actually a real thing, or if they just went ahead and made it up for the book. If there's any Sicilians watching this, or anybody who knows, I'd appreciate it if you tell me. But basically they have a tradition where the Don cannot refuse a favour from a fellow Sicilian on that particular day. So there's basically a line of locals who showed up to the wedding to ask the Don to help them out with something, hoping not to pass up the opportunity. The book presents this a little bit differently to how it was presented in the movie. For example, it starts off from the perspective of Amerigo Bonacera, who is a local undertaker, attending the court hearing of two college guys who savagely assaulted his daughter, beating her up pretty bad and leaving her permanently disfigured. The book makes a big deal about how Amerigo trusted the American justice system and tried to get the two guys convicted, but unfortunately due to a technicality, and the two guys having clean records and some important family connections, they basically got off with a slap on the wrist and didn't face any real justice. So Amerigo figures that, as a last resort, in order to properly avenge his daughter, he needs to go and ask the Don for a favour, leading to that iconic conversation where Amerigo basically begs the Don on his hands and knees for a favour, even offering to pay him instead, but the Don refuses and essentially psychologically manipulates him into having him in his pocket. That was one of the things about the book that kind of fascinated me, and it's something that I don't personally think that the movie conveyed very well, and that is that Vito is basically an expert psychological manipulator. All through the book, it's implied that Vito had a way of getting people not only to work for him, in the sense that you'd expect a feared and respected mob boss to do, but he essentially convinced people that he was kind of a surrogate father to them, that he wasn't interested in money or intimidation or even really loyalty. He was interested only in friendship, and I mean genuine friendship, like people felt as if they would do anything for the Don because he in turn would do anything for them. And it's interesting because later in the book, and this of course is completely absent from the movie from what I remember, you get a whole chapter that takes place decades earlier, during the Don's childhood, in his early 20s, where he starts out as basically a low-level crook, but due to his overall demeanour and the calculated way he went about things, he was able to build up a reputation as not necessarily a dangerous, cold-blooded killer, but kind of a good Samaritan who would do anything for the people in his community. Basically, before resorting to violence, he would always try to be more diplomatic and find common ground with the people he was negotiating with, often appealing to their good nature and gaslighting them into thinking that what he wanted them to do was in their best interest, even if it wasn't, and that they at least walked away from the deal thinking they got something out of it, even if they didn't. For example, there's a scene during that chapter where a local Italian single mother gets evicted from her apartment due to noise complaints about her son's dog. She gives up the dog, but the landlord evicts her anyway. So Vito, who was still a young man at the time, decides to intervene and confront the landlord. The conversation he has with the landlord is fascinating, since he never once tries to threaten or intimidate him, and he even tries to butter him up and convince him that letting her have the apartment back would be an act of kindness that would make him well respected in the community. He assures the guy that the dog no longer lives there, and it's not going to be a problem anymore, and he's not going to get complaints and things like that. And when the landlord declines, saying that he's already agreed to rent it out to another family for higher rent, the Don shoves a handful of cash into the guy's hands and tells him to keep it overnight and think it over. What's interesting about that is, sometime before then, Vito shot and killed a local mafioso who was trying to extort him, and although nobody knew for sure it was him, the rumour was still going around in the community that it was Vito who did it. So the landlord was basically second guessing himself, not knowing how to really process the offer, shortly after he visits Vito and hands him back the money, telling him that he's basically moved by his act of kindness, and it's restored his faith in humanity and reminded him of his duty as a Christian, and she can have her apartment back for the same rent as before. And Vito makes a point of asking, yeah, but she can keep the dog as well. And the landlord kind of reluctantly agrees, so he's basically right back to square one. The lady and the kid get to keep their house, and they don't have to pay a single penny extra in rent, and they get to also keep the dog, even though that initially wasn't part of the deal. Vito gets his money back, so it didn't cost him a penny, and more importantly, he now has two people in his pocket, both the lady, who is now indebted to him for life, and even the landlord, who, while being kind of wary about how dangerous Vito is rumoured to be, also sees him as a trustworthy friend and someone he can do business with who will treat him fairly. I just found all that really interesting, since it gives further context to how the Don became so powerful and why so many people love and respect him. He doesn't generally rule through fear and intimidation. He literally gaslights and manipulates people into flat out loving him. This is of course in contrast to how Michael ends up running things, or at least how it's implied he ends up running things. Because as I'm sure most of you watching this will know, Michael ends up taking over the family business and becoming the Don himself, yet he's nowhere near as shrewd or as tactful as Vito. In fact, it's heavily implied even early on in the book that Michael is a flat out psychopath, but we'll get to that later. So the Don takes people in, offers them favours in exchange for friendship and loyalty, but implies that at some point in the future he may or may not need a favour in return. And of course this keeps people in suspense because the favour the Don asks could literally be anything, including helping him to facilitate some sort of crime, possibly even murder. But the love and respect that they have for the Don is so high that they're literally willing to accept the risk of being implemented in organised crime just to get in his good books. It's quite interesting in my opinion. Long story short, the opening chapter does a lot of world building and does a great job at introducing you to all the prominent characters, as well as foreshadowing the events of the story. One thing that really took me by surprise was, as I alluded to before, despite the main characters being criminals, and some of them even being murderers, due to the nature of it being a story, characters have to be in some way relatable. The writer quite cleverly creates scenarios where, for the most part, their actions, while being horrible, are arguably justifiable given the circumstances. For example, Michael kills several people throughout the story, some of which in brutal fashion, but the situations the story puts him in almost makes it seem like he had no other choice. For example, there's a particular chapter where the Don gets shot multiple times in a failed assassination attempt because a rival mafioso wants to essentially use the Don's connections and influence to smuggle and sell drugs throughout the city, and the Don, being kind of an old-fashioned mob boss, politely refuses the offer. So some of the other factions within the New York families try to eliminate him, thinking that Sonny would be a lot easier to negotiate with and manipulate if he takes over. Michael, who as I mentioned before has no interest in being a mafioso, defends him at the hospital, and ends up getting bashed up by a corrupt cop on the mob's payroll, which leaves him permanently disfigured and in constant discomfort. The Corleones decide that if they want the Don to live, and as I mentioned before, the Don is loved and respected by pretty much everyone associated with him, they decide that Sollozzo, who initially ordered the hit, and the corrupt cop in his pocket both need to be whacked. Michael volunteers to do the deed himself, which leads to one of the more brutal scenes in the book. On a side note, that's one of the things about the book that was considered a bit edgy for the time. The extremely descriptive and brutal murder scenes. For example, Luca Brasi, who is hyped up early in the book as one of the Don's top enforcers, and a guy who everyone in the community was terrified of, since he had a thing for particularly gruesome tortures and executions, chopping people up with axes and stuff. He himself gets whacked pretty early on in the book, which was kind of a surprise given how much of an emphasis was put on the character being so feared. He gets killed in kind of a pathetic fashion, soiling himself while getting choked out from behind. Also, there are plenty of characters who get a lot of time dedicated to them in the book, and they're kind of built up to be loyal capos and stuff, who then get exposed as traitors and are either killed off screen or executed brutally. And it's actually quite heartbreaking when you get to know the characters and stuff and start to relate to them. But yeah, I digress. My point was, you could easily make the argument that what Michael did in that chapter was perfectly justifiable. Likewise, later in the book, when he returns to the States after being on the run in Sicily, he does a lot of messed up stuff and highlights his psychopathic tendencies. But again, you could easily argue that he was simply looking out for his family and trying to ensure their existence, as well as to live up to or even exceed his father's expectations. And you could also argue that with all the crap he went through, his wife getting blown up in a car bomb that was meant for him and all that, his disfigurement, his brother Sonny being whacked by the mob, his brother Fredo being an absolute degenerate scumbag, and his sister being horribly abused by her piece of trash husband, as well as multiple factions in the mob wanting him dead and his whole bloodline dead. You could argue that he was backed into a corner and was just acting accordingly given the circumstances. That's one of the things I really pondered for a while after finishing the book, and I really found it quite interesting how the very last scene is Michael's second wife saying a prayer for him in church, as she knows by that point he's committed multiple murders and might be an unrepentant sinner going to hell, which rightfully horrifies her. A pretty good example, I'd say, of moral ambiguity in literature. The things Michael does are evil for sure, but have logical motivations behind them. As far as how the book is structured, I mentioned before how it's told in a non-linear fashion, and each chapter follows a particular character. Well, this was a pretty good idea because it allowed us to experience aspects of the story from different perspectives. It's also, in my opinion, one of the issues with the book, because in my opinion, some of the characters are definitely more interesting than others, and the book, in my opinion, has some pretty unnecessary subplots. For example, the chapters that followed Vito, Michael, Sonny, Tom, Carlo, Connie, and the various other aspects of the Corleone family were all really interesting and exciting, but at the same time, chapters that followed some of the, I'd say, ancillary characters were so boring and seemed to go on forever. For example, one of the characters introduced in the beginning was Johnny Fontaine, who is a famous singer and Hollywood actor who also happened to be the Don's actual godson. Every chapter in the book that had him as the main focus was so boring and tedious in my opinion, and it just repeats the same crap over and over again. I got sick of reading about how he's lost his voice due to drinking and smoking and couldn't sing anymore, how he was addicted to sex, and how he was losing his sex appeal and all that, how he cheated on his wife numerous times but they have to be civil with each other for the sake of their kids, how he goes to these sleazy Hollywood parties and is just a complete degenerate in general. These things in theory aren't bad plot points, and the writing itself isn't necessarily bad, but for me it just takes up way too much of the book, and it repeats a lot of that crap over and over again, and it all pretty much takes place away from the city, and has nothing to do with the Corleones, or the main plot of the story. I'm actually glad that the movie ignored most of this, and the only aspect of the whole Johnny Fontaine subplot was in regards to the movie part he wanted as a favour from the Don. I'm sure you guys know about that famous scene where Tom Hagen, who is the Don's official consigliere, for those of you who don't know, that means he's basically a personal assistant or right-hand man, as well as a lawyer, tries to negotiate with some scumbag Hollywood producer to get Johnny the part, and when he refuses, he wakes up to find the head of his $80,000 breeding racehorse in his bed, which is terrifying if truth be told. In the movie, that's pretty much all you hear about Johnny Fontaine, but in the book he plays a far more predominant role, and it's just unnecessary padding in my opinion. It seemed so boring. There's also another chapter very late on in the book that, in my opinion, was just really tonally awkward, and again, just like the Johnny Fontaine situation, it had practically nothing to do with the main plot, and just felt like unnecessary padding to me. And that was the chapter that was based in Vegas, and follows the character Lucy, who in the beginning of the book was presented as Sonny's side piece, basically some idiot slut, and for whatever reason, after Sonny's death, the writer decides to make her a protagonist, and you get this really long, drawn-out, tedious chapter where Lucy is dicking around in Vegas, basically moping about Sonny's death, and how her pussy is too loose for any man to satisfy her, and she can't find a man with a penis as large as Sonny's. I'm not making this up. And she meets this former abortionist who wants to perform an experimental surgery procedure on her to tighten up her pussy. Yeah, I'm not joking, the book has a whole chapter with that as the main focus, and I was honestly pretty disgusted by it. Again, thank God that wasn't in the movie, because I dread to think what it would have been like on screen. I hated that chapter and everything about it. Speaking of, this alludes to one of my personal issues with the book. Not just this book, but this kind of literature in general, and that is there is so much smut in the book. So many unnecessary graphic sex scenes, with every minute detail being explicitly described, every single one of them. I get a lot of people like that, but me personally, I can't stand it. I honestly find stuff like that uncomfortable to read, and I personally prefer for it not to be there. But I could see the argument that making the reader uncomfortable with these scenes may actually be the whole point. Maybe it's supposed to highlight the degeneracy of these particular characters and their lifestyles, so bear that in mind. On that subject, there's also some aspects of the book that did make me really uncomfortable, in a way that made me care about the characters and the plot a little bit more. For example, there's a few scenes that describe some absolutely horrific domestic abuse, most notably Connie, who is the Don's daughter, being beaten up and humiliated by her scumbag husband Carlo, who, as I mentioned before, he is kind of presented as one of the book's villains. The scenes that are described from his perspective, with him trying to justify his infidelity and the horrible way he treats his wife, made me legit mad. I was honestly so angry when reading them, and got so immersed, to the point where when Sonny beat the absolute piss out of him, despite Sonny himself being a total scumbag who cheats on his own wife and stuff, I was very satisfied with him defending his little sister, and I found that really relatable. Also, with Michael having Carlo whacked at the end of the book, and making his sister a widow and his godchildren fatherless, despite that being, as I alluded to before, one of the many acts of evil that Michael perpetuates throughout the book. Again, under the circumstances, it makes perfect sense. I mean, Carlo was an absolute, irredeemable scumbag of a character, who I'm sure no reader felt any remorse for. You see what I mean when I talk about moral ambiguity and how the book presents extremely violent acts as arguably justifiable. So yeah, the book is a bit of a mixed bag, with at least two very uncomfortable and unnecessary side plots, and certain characters being the main focus of certain chapters. It was an interesting idea, but it led to some of the aforementioned issues with the book's pacing. When I think about all the characters who got their own chapters, the most interesting one in my opinion was probably Tom Hagen. I'd say he was probably my favourite character, aside from Catherine's father, who is this old preacher guy. He was kind of based. But yeah, Tom Hagen, his backstory was the most interesting to me. He stands out from the rest of the Corleone mob in the sense that he isn't a blood relative of the family, and he's also not even Italian, he's German-Irish, and was brought into the family by Sonny, who was his friend growing up. Coming from a broken home and being estranged from his own parents, Vito saw this and he decided to take Tom under his wing, becoming kind of a surrogate father. That leads to a bit of an interesting dynamic where Tom is more loyal to the Don and treats him better than even his own actual sons, and he's also much wiser and more competent than them, leading to Vito making Tom his consigliere, which is significant since he's the only one in the entire mafia who isn't Italian. It gives him kind of an inferiority complex, but at the same time a deep desire to prove himself. And there's even a scene in the book where Vito, who is old and dying, says to Tom, "You've been a good son." And you can tell that that really means a lot to him. I just found that whole aspect of the story really interesting for some reason. He's one of the few characters in the book who I'd say was almost sympathetic, since you get the sense that he isn't really a violent man, and if he wasn't geographically connected with the Corleones during his childhood, he would never have become a criminal. He probably would have gone legit. I think Vito actually implies this late on in the book, where him and Michael make the decision to quietly phase Tom out of the business, which was actually kind of sad for some reason. So yeah, The Godfather is certainly a book that's a bit of a mixed bag. It has a bit too much smut for my liking, a few too many boring side plots, and characters who took up way too many pages, and it's a bit uncomfortable to read at times. But I can't deny that for the most part I really enjoyed it, and as I said at the start of the video, I read it in like a week, while being very busy, so you can tell it was an enjoyable experience for me. I'd give the book a solid 8 out of 10. A great, thought-provoking story that was very mature and brutal at times, but also somewhat satisfying considering how it all turns out. Thanks for watching, guys. I really enjoyed making this video. As I said before, this is my first ever book review. Any feedback you guys can give would be much appreciated. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching and God bless.